Well, so you're saying discipleship leads to conflict.
Yes, it does. Yes. Conflict in the sense that you're going to be countercultural, and conflict in the sense that you're going to have to disagree with people, but also go a step further out of love and care for them and try to persuade them that they ought to be doing what you're doing. And again, if we just put it in those naked kind of terms, it sounds really, really harsh and rough, doesn't it? Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Nathan, 2 Timothy 4, verse 2 has been on my mind quite a bit lately. Shall I read it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for all of us who haven't just perfectly popped that into our minds when you suggested it.
I shall read it. So recall, this is one of the pastoral letters, and this is Paul's exhortation to young
We'll just
Timothy.
imagine you're doing it in King James because that would sound better, but I mean, go for
boy,
it.
it sure
Whatever
would.
you got here.
So alas, this is the ESV. We'll make do. Here we go. So 2 Timothy 4:2, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. So I'm gonna pause there at that verse. It's quite truncated, of course. That's a single verse. But I want to hold it there for a second. It's the in and out of season clause that's captured my attention here. I'm finding more and more, Nathan, that my interactions when I step outside of my house have this kind of dynamic going on. That basically I'm finding myself in a position where I'm going to have to talk about why I do things differently.
Yeah.
But it's not even a question. It's not a question. It doesn't arise in the form of, why are you a Christian? It's not in that general form. It's more, why don't you do such and such a thing? Okay, I'll stop speaking in abstract terms. I'm in that phase of my life where weekends are consumed with children's birthday parties. You go through those. Yeah, there are those different seasons. So one season of life, you're going to weddings. Another season, it's birthday parties. Then it's graduations. And well, we won't talk about what comes next, but we'll keep it lighthearted for now. But I'm at this party, and the host, just casually offers me something that might make my experience slightly less stressful, and it's not alcoholic. So use your imaginations. So I'm bringing this up not in a spirit of judgment at all. This was just more. This is becoming normal, and this is happening more and more. And then it turned to a question of, oh, well, why not? Oh, so how do your beliefs affect how you look at this kind of thing? And I was completely caught off guard, not at all prepared to go down that conversational trail. And this is happening more and more and more. So that's an illustration of the kind of,
and to be clear, it's not because
tone.
you could. It's not because you couldn't. It's just that you didn't frame it as like, oh, I'm getting ready to answer a question about this.
Yes, exactly. And
so the context that these questions come up is where the surprising element is.
Right. And I did, of course, talk about it. When we did discuss it, and I did my best to be persuasive and holistic, but it's the unexpected nature of it that I'm kind of drawing our attention to. This is happening more and more, and it's a picture of the changing landscape of our cultural moment. And it's also, this is what it feels like on the ground when you see that Christian influence is really on the wane. We say that a lot, but I am finding myself more and more in contexts where the sheer mental furniture of Christianity is absent. It is just not there.
Try this one on. This is just pure thinking out the top of my head here. So oftentimes, thinking out loud, thinking out loud. Yeah. So oftentimes I think you have older generations of people say, well, these young people, they go off to college and they walk away from their faith, tisk, tisk. And I'm always
Mm,
like, hold on a second there. Um, Couple things at play, but one of them is that the young people at college are interacting with a far broader degree of diversity in their cultural interactions and wrestling with a series and set of questions that you as an older person don't have to deal with. And so the pressure to sort things out is was historically much higher at the university level because it was probably for the first time in your life that you were deeply embedded in community with people from different walks of life, different religions, countries, language, parts of the
mhm.
country, um, and ideas. And so there was a bit of disorientation that came from that, and a lot of opportunity that was really good as well. I think what we're largely seeing as a trend in a post Christian direction is that that experience is now becoming the normal experience for everybody. It's not just like a university experience. You can have that experience at the airport, or at your, a birthday party for a neighborhood kid. And so there's a sense in which there's just an expansion of globalization coming home to roost, not just in terms of economic things, but also in the full on diversity of even within a geographic location, just the sheer number of personal meanings and methods for making that meaning are clashing into each other, not necessarily like in a violent way, but in a way that like permeates the atmosphere of one of continuous disruption for the person who thinks they understand the culture in which they live, but then steps outside of their door and recognizes that the wind is blowing in a different direction than they expected it to be coming from.
Yeah, it's a disorienting feeling, and a picture of the fact that we are here now in mission territory. This has been the case for a while, but I think it's ramped up pretty drastically. And you can just again, you're gonna start noticing this in your daily life. And so there I mean, there are a couple of kind of broad observations that we can make about the nature of some of these interactions. And I want to tread so carefully because one one thing I've become keenly aware of, Nathan, in my own life is a tendency to sound like I'm, making judgments here, that I'm being very judgmental. And I really want to be careful. I want to be careful with that because I'm finding over and over again in these interactions and in these different settings, I'm encountering a real open-mindedness and spirit of generosity in so many people and a real willingness to have these conversations about the nature of belief, about values.
As I've
And
referred
it's
to as the spiritual munchies.
the spiritual munchies. And so I think part of that has been disorienting as well in a good way because evangelical culture in the United States has been very protective in many ways. And I mean I know that this has been well intentioned in the past, but you're I mean I'm seeing a lot of people who basically are very eager to talk through some of these items. And yeah, they're just interested in these conversations. They're interested in why you stand out, and why you're different, why you're odd.
Mhm.
See, that's another observation that's worth bringing in here. You you're going to be more and more of the odd person out, and it's going to be more difficult to blend in with your surroundings when that's part of the changing landscape as well. And I don't say that as a word of warning or caution. I just think it's something we should all be prepared for.
Yeah, well, so
And
there's an
I
easy
think
way out of
yeah.
this, Cameron, though. Here's an easy
Oh
way to
yeah.
get to, like, if you don't wanna have to worry about this, I can solve this for you instantly. All you have to do is make your faith solely an intellectual enterprise, and
Right.
as long as it doesn't you don't feel any compulsion to have it change the comportment of your life, then it won't conflict with anything. So, looky there, problem solved.
Yeah, and the soundbite we've talked about before on this podcast is I believe that Jesus is Lord, but that's just my personal opinion. So if
Right. So I'm saying you could that like we laugh when we say that, but I think that is
Mhm.
the default position for a lot of people, which does get you out of a lot of conflict of you saying, "You know what? I'm not going to do the thing all of my neighbors are doing."
Yes, well, and it does get uncomfortable. So I don't want to say that it doesn't. I'm saying a high degree of generosity and an open-mindedness, but it is one thing to say, I don't want to do, I prefer to abstain from whatever this practice is that you're engaging in. It's another thing to go a step further and say, and I think you ought to consider not doing it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That will get uncomfortable. And again, I don't think that we take this as an opportunity to be obnoxious and or antagonistic, certainly not. But there's no non-neutral way to say to someone in effect, I think you ought to think about changing your life.
Right. Yeah.
So
How dare you, Cameron,
that's that yeah, so they're in
to interfere in somebody
they're
else's
in
life?
right. I mean, at a very basic level, of course, the gospel, part of that gospel message is it's not you ought to change your life, it's you urgently need to change your life.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, but again, I like missiologist Leslie Newbigin's phrase here where he declares the gospel is public truth, meaning that, if you follow Christ, there will be public consequences in your life. The
Yeah.
notion
So,
that yeah,
well, so you're saying discipleship leads to conflict?
yes, it does. Yes. Conflict in the sense that you're going to be countercultural, and conflict in the sense that you're going to have to disagree with people, but also go a step further out of love and care for them. And again, you're building relationships. So do this in a holistic fashion, but go a step further and try to persuade them that they ought to be doing what you're doing. And again, if we just put it in
Yeah.
those naked kind of terms, it sounds really, really harsh and rough, doesn't it? Because that I think in many of these settings, most people are perfectly comfortable with looking at Christianity as an option, but
Hmm.
they're not comfortable, or a lifestyle. They're not comfortable with seeing it as an entire way of life that goes to the heart of reality.
Yeah. So I guess the whole time though, I'm wondering, to what degree do Christians believe that? I mean, you should, but
Yeah,
is
that's the
there
rub.
is there a bit of complicity that we have in the development of that presupposition? Because it's not just a, yeah, I don't know. It seems like we can own that a little bit ourselves.
Oh, I think we have to. Yes, we absolutely have to. I mean, again, in North America, because the influence of Christianity has been very strong in this nation, and the nature of that influence is another item of discussion. But certainly in the past, in the United States, the church has exercised a strong influence, and the Bible has had a strong influence on this nation, and it has made it possible to build a lot of cultural bridges. But again, that is what appears to be changing. And there's a lot of different language that's being used right now to try to capture this. You know, in a sense, 10 years down the road, we'll have a very refined vocabulary for this cultural shift that's happening right now. And
So
suffice it to say, right now, that influence is just waning drastically. And we're struggling now in a world where we don't have as much cultural influence. We're having to relearn what it means to be a faithful witness, and it's going to be a lot more costly in terms of just the social cost that comes along with it.
okay, hang on a second though. Back up. I have some questions. So for starters, the lots of people are more than happy to try to persuade other people of different things. So, diet, exercise, products,
Yep.
all sorts of things people are willing to persuade you on, and people want to be persuaded oftentimes. So, persuasion isn't the new thing or the uncouth thing, it's the category of it. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, if it's a pursuit that's voluntaristic, it's something that you want. It's some habit you want to pick up, and it's firmly tied to your own preferences and your own wishes. I think that's relatively non-threatening,
Well, and
right?
people don't sense a judgment if you don't. So if I think,
Correct.
"Hey, you should only wear this kind of socks," and you decide not to, you know, whatever.
Right.
Um, so
Yeah.
so that element's going on. The second one though is I often ask this question, like, are you living a life that you wish for your kids?
Mm,
Or are you living a life that you think would be good for other people? And that's a different level of like, you're not going to persuade somebody to try to do something that you yourself are not totally convinced is actually better.
mhm,
So
mhm.
there's a little bit of a little bit of introspection and self stability that's a prerequisite for some of this type of interaction.
Here's a
Not
question
an
I have for you,
arrogance.
Nathan. Sure. But well, here's a question I have for you, Nathan. I think this might be a helpful detour, and maybe it's not even a detour, but I'm curious about how we have these conversations and how we work on being persuasive and non-judgmental.
Mm, yeah. So,
Because I think that's going to be a big that will be a challenge and a hurdle. And I mean, in a sense, let's just get this out of the way. I mean, judgments are something that is just part of everyday life. You have to make judgments, and
mhm,
by judgmental, we don't mean basically making evaluative judgments. Everybody has to do that. I would mean at least we can tease this out a little bit more too, Nathan, as well. But by judgmental, I mean that you have cultivated a sense of superiority in your mind to other
mhm.
people and you look down on them. How do we actively work against that kind of a mindset or giving that kind of impression? Or is it a risk that we just simply have to take?
Yep, I'm gonna quote my mother on this one, because I think I definitely did have, in a higher degree and still have to some degree, these tendencies, um, and my mom would always say this line to me. She would say, "Nathan, the Lord has a lot of work to do on us all." And so if we see that Christ is the standard, not ourselves as the standard, then it's an invitation to something that isn't to be like us. So I think there is a high degree of arrogance if you would say, I think your life should look like mine and it would be a lot better if you were like me. Like
Right.
that sounds weird even coming out of my mouth. On the other hand, Paul gets a little bit of that. Follow me as I follow Christ, but in that he's saying that the contours of my life um, are an invitation into another possible way of being that's predicated on the
Mhm.
goodness of God, and I'm a reflection of that, but I'm not the source of it. So there's a sense there, I think, in which we remember what our actual goal in life is as people, just to be conformed to the image of Christ. Then, as we're becoming more and more clear of what that is and where we stand in relationship to that, then the distinguishing characteristics that would lead to judgmentalism kind of fly out the
Mm.
window there. So I think that's step one. Step two is, I think, an honesty and a willingness to say that I'm I'm giving you an example of another way to do something, but there's no coercion necessarily involved. So persuasion and
Yeah.
coercion are very different. I am convinced that a spoon is the best utensil to eat Cheerios with. Now, and I teach my children that. Um, Maybe I'm warping their little minds and brainwashing them, but I really do think that that is the best utensil for eating Cheerios. In an emergency, a fork would probably work. Knife, a little trickier. Um, but I teach them to use a spoon, and maybe they'll grow up and eat their Cheerios with something else. Sometimes I also just drink it straight out of a mug, which is a little bit of like the college guy move. But I'm just saying, I don't even eat Cheerios that much. I don't know where this example came from. All that to say is like there are things in life that we think are the best, and we teach other people to do them because we genuinely think that this will bring a higher degree of satisfaction in their life and cause fewer messes, whatever. And so we're
Mhm.
modeling that. But if people choose not to do that, then there isn't, I don't think we need a law against that. Um,
Mhm.
and so I think there's that comparative tension. I'm trying to grow into the likeness of Christ. I'm inviting you to come along with me. Is very different than why doesn't your life look like mine? And it would be better if you were more like me. That sounds different. And presenting it as a here's what I've found to be really helpful and fruitful and meaningful in my life, and I think is true, not just as an option, but it really has some bearing on reality. So off the top of my mind, those are sort of the two
Mm.
postures of avoiding comparison and coercion would be. I don't know totally what the right answer is, but I know that those are like don't fall out of bed on either of those sides.
Yeah. No, that's good. I mean, well, there's no quick right answer. This is something that has to be worked out dialogically, which is what we're what we're doing. We're hoping to get the wheel started there. I think that's really helpful that pointing to Christ as the key exemplar and rather than
Mhm.
saying, "Hey, look at me, be like me." No, we all fall short. So be this he is the he's the shining beacon of what it means to be a person. And then, yeah, to avoid coercive techniques, which, let's face it, again, we're in a cultural moment where coercion is a pretty big item on the docket, I think, in a lot of our public discourse. But yeah, aiming, because persuasion's harder. If you're
Mhm.
if you're looking to actually talk to somebody and maybe help bring them to a place of deep inward change. I mean, when you say it like this, you recognize that this is a spiritual endeavor, and you're going to need some help.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I mean,
But
so you can get
yeah,
your kid to
the
do the
stakes
right
are high.
thing. You can get your kid to
Right.
do the right thing. What you want them to do is to want to do the right thing,
Right.
and that's a whole different ballgame.
Yes, and I think the only item I would add to our little list here on avoiding seeming judgmental in the sort of spiritual elitism sense is that the person needs to be able to see that you care about them. I think that's
Sure.
going to be
Yeah.
absolutely vital, and that goes along with a lot of what you've just said, Nathan. If you believe that you have genuinely discovered a way of doing something that is beneficial to you and helps promote your flourishing, why wouldn't you want to share that with somebody?
Yeah, well,
Yeah. So.
there's also a really helpful if you look at Paul's list of condemnations. I'm thinking First Corinthians 6 here, where da 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 da, big long list, won't inherit the kingdom of God, and this is what some of you once were. And so there's also
Hmm.
a degree of that extra set of saying the position you're in is not a fixed position, and I don't necessarily hey, I actually used to do that too, and thought that was necessary for pleasure, but um, so yeah, humanizing it a bit and being honest, I think is part of it, of recognizing that real change is possible and that it's not
Hmm.
um, a fixed way of being. But you do have to be convinced that
Hmm.
the way of life that you're living is better.
Now, let me just lay out for our listeners something that you probably are already sort of aware of, but here's what is actively working against us as Christians in these conversations. It's a really powerful assumption. We've talked about it before on the podcast, but it's the notion that human beings don't have an intrinsic purpose. You make your purpose,
Right.
or you create your own meaning. So if we're pointing to Christ, for instance, and we're saying, don't look at me, look at Jesus, we're making a really powerful assumption. We're saying he's the standard.
Hmm.
Look no further than him. In all of human history, there's only been one fully human person, and it's Christ. So I think that's absolutely right. Now, that's a radical departure from our key cultural assumptions. And most of our debates, and again, this is, if you want to go back to the dusty philosophers that helped Nathan and I along the way here, and I hope you do. The dusty philosopher in question here he's still alive. He's in his 90s now. Is Alistair McIntyre. I do wish this is one of those books I wish many, many more people would read. Every now and then a book will come out. There are so many books that are published in a given year, and most of them are probably not worth your time. This is one of those books that it's a landmark book. But when
Man,
after
you are building
Virtue
this
came
up.
out,
Everybody get out. Get ready to make a note on your phone or write this down.
yeah, but now let me smash it down. It's so boring in the way it's written,
I have it sitting here on
but
my
it is a
desk and have not made it through it yet. It's that exciting.
yes. It's very dry, but it's very clear. It's a magnificent achievement of a book, and it completely diagnoses our age. But basically, one of the key points he makes with a lot of subtlety and
You you're
sophistication in the
killing us.
book.
You gotta say the name of the
Kill,
book.
oh yeah, After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre. So, and Whose Justice, Which Rationality is also really great, by the way, but I don't want to push it too far here. But he just says, he basically says, we most of our discussions on, I mean, our major debates, our cultural debates about what we should do, how we should live our lives, are the word he uses is interminable. There are several different facets to the argument.
Oh
One
wait, so
touches on
one of the
something
key
he
words
calls
is interminable, and you're wondering why people haven't read it more.
right. But one of those facets concerns his what he calls emotionalism. I'm not going to talk about that right here. I feel like we need footnotes for this podcast sometimes. But he basically says we can't agree on what human beings are for. So these conversations, because we think, basically, if you say that there's an end to human life, end in the sense of purpose or telos, if you say that, then now you've introduced a whole set of constraints that modern people don't want to deal with. If there's design, if there's purpose, if human beings have been made, crafted, knit in our mother's wombs by a maker, then there's a claim on our lives and there is obligation involved. And we don't want that. We want our options open. And I think this makes, again, I'm enough of a modern person, an American, for this to make perfect sense to me. But it's dead wrong. And it's killing us as a culture. It really
Yeah.
is. I mean,
Okay.
the other, yeah, go
Well,
ahead,
I was just
Nathan.
gonna say, so like, let's put some legs back on this though, because it's like you said, dusty philosopher. But so the reality there though is that if you are living in a culture where everybody makes their own meaning, there is no purpose to humanity. Hey, psychedelics are a great way to experience something without it having
Yeah,
any moral
right.
demand on your life. So why wouldn't you? So if you make your own meaning and there is no purpose that, or like anything you're shooting for other than an experience, um, there you have it. There's the foundation of the tension, a la Alistair McIntyre's and whatever's going on at your child's birthday party.
Well, I mean, and that's such a good point, Nathan, because okay, let's subtract the notion that there's a design or a purpose or an end to human life. What are you going to say in those cases? If somebody says, "Well, no, I mean, this is a mind expanding experience and I'm after something that's really going to take me to the furthest frontiers of experience." What, well, I mean, what's your argument going to be with the person? I mean, what are you going to appeal? You have to, unless you have some sort of a fixed standard or normative standard in place for human life and human flourishing. But that's the very thing that we've been so bashful about. This is where I do think we have to take our share of ownership as Christians. I think we've been fraidy cats on this one because we've wanted to curry favor with Christianity's cultured despisers. This is the language I'm using from Friedrich Schleiermacher. And he infamously, back in the day when he was writing on Christianity, he was a liberal theologian. He said that his stated purpose was to reach Christianity's cultured despisers. But at a certain point, you have to be willing to be despised. And again, make no bones about it, you will be in some cases. I mean, that is going to happen. And but so this is the powerful kind of these are the factors that are working against us as Christians, culturally speaking, these assumptions. And we need to be aware of it, and we need to be willing to to basically say, no, I think human beings are made with a purpose. There's intrinsic meaning to human life.
Yeah, so
And
I mean, I
you
think
have to
that's a
speak out of that
valuable.
truth.
Yeah, so but there's a sense then in which like I guess I haven't gotten myself super worked up about transhumanism as a threat to humanity. Um I see it as a move of despair perhaps. But it's very hard to transcend something you can't actually define. And so modification without purpose
Yeah.
is a interesting, like I mean, so like what we're saying here is that this, and we're muddling our way to it, but hopefully it's becoming clear that if you could wrap your head, or if you're a Christian and listening to this and could wrap your head around thinking about the world as if your life had no purpose or collective meaning, then a lot of what you see in the world that everybody's like, "Oh, that's just crazy. That's ridiculous. I can't believe the kids these days." No, all that makes perfect sense.
Mhm. Yep.
So, if you can embrace what Cameron called dusty philosophy, it gives you a set of it gives you the pair of sunglasses to pop on and look at the world and be like, "Oh, okay. I see what's going on here, and that makes total sense." Not that it's good.
Yeah.
It's just that like, oh, that's not surprising to me at all.
Yeah. And I think let me just bring in another factor here that I think that is sort of a sobering fact. So many of our cultural pastimes or recreational habits that I'm seeing as I move about in these settings as a
As I
I'm
walk through
I'm
your city,
pink
I see you're very religious in every way.
Exactly. I mean, I'm painting my the picture that's emerging of me, going to satanic metal concerts and all that is just as this, weird anthropologist doing field research all the time. But the truth is, I'm wired like a writer, so I'm just always watching. I'm kind of a wallflower. It's not like I'm doing much in these settings, but I'm not. But part of what I'm noticing though is most of our habits are habits of despair. And my thinking here is guided by Pascal. So Pascal points out in Pensées that the two great challenges facing us in the world, and they haven't changed since he wrote that, are apathy and diversions, distractions.
Mhm.
And he points out that the fact that we pursue all of these different diversions proves that we're in despair. And so it's been my experience that what most people want to do, especially younger people, and I'm including people, and up to the age of 40. I mean, that's still young, okay? But most people
Sure.
want to pursue habits where they can depart from reality for a little bit.
Yeah.
They want to find ways to do that. So if reality is so unbearable that you either have to escape it through inebriation or some kind of a fantasy, that's it's something has gone very tragically wrong, and it's a sign of deep sadness all
Right.
around
Okay.
us.
So
Yeah.
hang on, because you made a point that I was hoping we would get to is that there are two ways to look at it. You can look at these cultural upheavals and changes and be terrified out of your ever loving mind. And by and large, particularly evangelical Christians are clinically the most terrified subculture in
Very
America.
scared. Yeah.
Very scared. If you look at walls, gates, gun ownership for self protection, all of it, evangelicals lead the chart in thinking that everything is going wrong. And it's not that stuff isn't going wrong. It's just the degree of material that's expanded on self preservation is disproportionately high. Let's say among compared to other Americans. So there's this way of you can look at cultural change and be terrified, or you can be grieved. And so I think you use the idea, we're talking about sadness here, that we're seeing behaviors of despair. Um, yeah, and those do have like destructive consequences collectively. None of them are just embedded individualistically. They have massive influences on our culture. But if you're so you can be worried and concerned about those and work structurally to mitigate that. But if you're doing that out of a sense of self-preservation, you're not doing that in a Christ-like way. If you're doing that out of a sense of deep sadness, of like you're engaging in behaviors that are ultimately destructive, not only to you, but to your family and to your culture. And I grieve that you feel the need to do that. That's different.
Mhm.
And so there might be some similar outworkings, but it's worth taking our time to check our motivations there of saying, as Christians, A, can we make sense of this? Do we understand this? Okay, I think we're trying to outline this here. And then, do I have the capacity, if I'm being conformed in the image of Christ, to love people enough to take action when I see things that are destructive? So, yeah, there's just a little thought experiment there of am I operating out of a sense of sadness or out of a sense of terror in response to the world that's happening around me? I think, Cameron, back to your earlier question, that you know how we often say people are like, well, what was the Q&A like at that university or something? People have this expectation that like if you go and you speak truth, people will be angry about it because they
Mhm.
see the
Yep.
news stories of, whatever happening. Um, you know what? 99.99% of the time, the tone in which the truth is communicated dictates the vehemence or the openness
Mhm.
of the person who's listening. And so, yes, if you're in a situation in which you are attempting to be culturally persuasive and the other person feels judged, demeaned, uh, like you're treating them like, well, you just do that because you're an idiot, there are lots of
Mhm.
ways in order for that to go wrong. However, if you are pointing to something and they genuinely sense that you care about them and their life, most people are willing to listen to that respectfully. And so I think there is a lot of great work that can be done here. I'm optimistic about the power of Christ-like living and persuasion, and for that to be. And I think as the world gets more weary and runs some of its attempts to their logical conclusions and they don't work out, there will be a continued openness to things that provide long-term stability and hope. and the ability to cope and delight in reality without some chemical stimulants along the side. So I think we continue living our lives of joy, of speaking clearly about what that means, but that our fundamental posture to the culture around us when it goes awry is one out of sadness, not one of terror, but maintains an engaged posture of a willingness to point people toward hope. And that's why, I mean, shouldn't surprise you. You're listening to Thinking Out Loud. It's a podcast about current events and Christian hope. Let's be those people.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.